To our honored guests, Dean Atwood, Dr. Rogoff, faculty, professionals, and students, welcome to the 2004 Harvard International Development Conference. That's right. You've come just in time for spring in Boston, which we've worked very hard to provide for you. And I'm very, very happy that you decided to come in on this beautiful day to listen to this important talk. A Southern poet, Henry Timmad, once said, "Spring is a true reconstructionist." So we set upon today, in this first weekend of real spring in Boston, to discuss development in the uncertainty of reconstruction and transformation of nations. We selected this theme to reflect upon the new challenges faced by all those concerned with community development around the world, through the increased occasion of war, conflict, and major social, economic, and political transition. We are honored by the cadre of distinguished panelists, faculty, and academics that we have to lead us in this discussion. They bring with them years of experience and diverse viewpoints to provide fresh analysis and debate on these issues. This year is the 10th anniversary of the HIDC, and we are commemorating with an expanded list of activities and an innovative structure. We have structured our conversations around 4 tracks of analysis, centering on market mechanisms, governing bodies, and social institutions as actors in development. We have given human security a 4th track of analysis for its obvious, weighty implications in today's global environment. Further, we have titled our panels to pose provocative questions in international development, to encourage participants to find solutions to the concerns that we address. We have created this agenda with an objective in mind, revealed by Napoleon Hill, an analyst of leadership in the early 1900s. First comes thought, he said, then organization of thought into ideas and plans, then transformation of plans into reality. The beginning, as you'll observe, is in your imagination. We believe the value of this conference is to bring together the great minds and practitioners in the field of development with the great minds and practitioners of the future to finally share, imagine, and transform the ideas created today into better practice in development for the future. As the largest student-run conference on development in the nation, we could not exist without the dedicated work of our 15-member leadership team and our 65 other student volunteers. They all come from the Kennedy School of Government, MIT, and the Harvard Business School. These volunteers committed endless hours making this event happen, despite a hectic school schedule where every day is an assignment, 3 classes to attend, reading, and more. Please take a moment during the conference to greet these volunteers and give them your feedback on how we're doing. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, without whom this event really would not be possible. I'd like to now turn to our keynote speaker. We are enormously honored that Brian Atwood, the new dean of the Hubert Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, has joined us this evening. The dean has amazing experience in the area of reconstruction, peace operations, and international development. As a former graduate of the University of Minnesota, I am especially honored. Here to introduce Dean Atwood is one of our own, the current director of the Center of International Development at the Kennedy School. Before this, he served as a chief economist and research director at the International Monetary Fund. He was also a professor of economics and international affairs at Harvard, Princeton, and the London School of Economics, among other institutions. He has been a consultant to the national banks and governments of many countries and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Econometric Society. A former national Grand Master in chess, he is a prolific author on issues of international development and finance, including exchange rates, international debt, and international monetary policy. We are happy to have him with us. Please welcome Dr. Kenneth Rogoff.
Thank you, Alessandra, for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's really an honor to be able to address the 10th Harvard's 10th Annual International Development Conference and to be able to introduce Dean Atwood. This is an extraordinary conference when I look at the breadth of issues and topics being covered and the number of different points of view that you're bringing to bear on the conference theme of reconstruction and transformation, which, needless to say, puts together many of the most important social, political, and economic issues of our time. And I think issues that tonight's keynote speaker will tell us a lot about. I think I will, excuse me, and I guess one further thing I would say is that it's remarkable that there are so many young people here interested in studying these issues, because I've certainly been at places where a conference like this would be much smaller, and it's just great to see such interest. Dean Atwood is our keynote speaker, and he's talking about after Iraq what, and I sure want to know the answer to that. I don't know about you, and I guess, I don't know if this is related to a Council on Foreign Relations Task Force where he wrote a report, Iraq the day after. Now, I want to know when is the day after, but maybe he'll tell us in his talk. Dean Atwood has a very long and distinguished career that began in foreign service in 1966, where he served in the embassies of Cote d'Ivoire and Spain. And of course, today he's now the Dean of the Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, where he'll probably try to persuade a few of you to move someday. And before that, he had been here for 3 years as a faculty member at the Kennedy School. And in 2001, he was UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's on UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's panel on peace operations, and was the only American on this panel that was recommended major changes in the UN's peacekeeping and peacebuilding operations. And I don't know if you're reconvening this panel anytime soon, but be very interested to hear what you have to say. Another important job he held was as the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, better known to all of you as USAID, for 7 years from May 1993 through 1999. And he made sweeping changes in terms of how it was managed and focused its development strategy. I think these changes are really widely appreciated around the development community, and he also helped redirect AID's focus to issues like global climate change, conflict prevention, and health, which of course are some of the central topics here. And he has done many distinguished individual missions, including leading presidential delegations to Haiti, El Salvador, and East Africa. He was President Clinton's humanitarian relief coordinator during the Kosovo crisis, and he served as chairman of the Overseas Private Investment Council, which some of you may know as OPIC. He has won many, many awards over time, receiving honorary doctorate from American University and rewards for distinguished public service. I find receiving the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award is extremely impressive. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome Dean Atwood as our speaker tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rogov. My mother would have appreciated that introduction. Let me say it's wonderful to be back here at the Kennedy School, and I'm delighted that the students who are out on the lawn drinking beer were able to come in. I didn't think it would be possible to lure you here. I do recognize several from about 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm wondering when you're going to go out and get a job, actually, but that's a sore point, isn't it? I realize that getting jobs in public affairs, especially international development, is not so easy unless you want to go to Iraq, which is not the most attractive thing in the world. Some of you may know this is my home state, and I'm delighted to be back here. It's the home also of the Red Sox and the Patriots and the Celtics, and home as well of soft power. Now, your dean, Joe Nye, knows how much I appreciate his contribution to the debate over U.S. foreign policy, particularly his correct assessment that to be successful, the United States must engage comprehensively, employing its diplomacy, its assistance programs, even its cultural attributes alongside its military assets. But I have frankly never liked the phrase soft power. How many politicians in Washington do you know who want to be caught embracing anything soft? Caught, I said. You can imagine my chagrin when a few weeks ago in San Francisco I was introduced as one of the nation's leading advocates of soft power. I guess it's time to concede that Joe Nye has coined a very durable phrase. Wasn't it Samuel Johnson who said that language is the dress of thought? And it is good, hard-headed, pragmatic, and unsoft thought, no matter what it is called. This International Development Conference, it's very, very impressive to see what you've put together and the people that you've invited here. You've got some of the real experts, many of whom I worked with in government and have served on various commissions to study this issue of post-conflict transitions. Afghanistan and Iraq have served to underscore the extraordinary challenge posed by post-conflict transitions, as well as serious structural and institutional deficiencies within the U.S. government and at the United Nations. I want to address some of these issues today. The conventional wisdom in Washington during my tenure in government was that there had not been a positive transition from conflict since Japan and Germany, and that it was all because of the incompetence of the United Nations. That attitude obviously has been reinforced by the Bush administration, who sees even less value in the United Nations. Personally, I like the line used by an old colleague of mine who said, "Blaming the UN for its failures is like blaming Fenway Park for the Red Sox." Having served on the Brahimi panel, I can tell you that the UN is ahead of the U.S. government in examining its own house. It has improved its peacekeeping office, introduced better planning, and has created a peace-building capacity much improved. Still, there is a long way to go, and there has been little help from the Security Council members in doing these things. Most of these changes have been internal. Not much money has been devoted to it, and a great deal still needs to be done. Meanwhile, our government is busy learning that Iraq is not Japan or Germany, and that our capacity for carrying out peace operations virtually alone is severely limited. While the President is unwilling to admit our inadequacies or even a single mistake in judgment, we proceed on the assumption that we can pacify, stabilize, and democratize Iraq with a small coalition supporting a dominant American authority. The chaos that is Iraq today was born out of fundamental errors of judgment about the complexity of the society we have occupied, a belief that we didn't need the UN and the international community, and the absence of planning, especially in the security area. It was also a mistaken acceptance by our political leaders that U.S. government departments, whose missions traditionally have not included post-conflict operations, could in fact succeed in the enormous task of nation building. At this juncture, we should be well beyond the debate over whether we need a capacity to do nation building. I've served on 3 commissions on this subject, and each has provided a solid analysis of the challenges and several recommendations for change. Each study concluded, as did James Traub in his timely New York Times magazine piece last Sunday, that nation building is no longer a subject for debate, we will get it right or pay the price. Can anyone doubt today that we are now paying that price? Before I share some thoughts on what we might do to create an improved capacity for handling post-conflict situations, let me suggest that we have an even more important priority: preventing these situations in the first instance. No matter how competent we become at nation building, we will never find an efficient, inexpensive formula for doing this work. The collapse of a society comes at tremendous costs in lives, in deeply ingrained ethnic tension, in the destruction of infrastructure and economic capacity, and in lost hope. It takes many years and billions of dollars to overcome these problems. We idealize the transitions in Japan and Germany, but we occupied these thoroughly defeated countries for more than 7 years and spent billions of dollars to transform them. And we couldn't have done it at all had the people of these nations been unwilling to cooperate. Both countries had also experienced periods of democracy in their history. Are we willing to ask the American taxpayer to support three or more nation-building exercises carried out simultaneously well into the future? Do we, as a society, have the patience, perseverance, and political will to manage a world of increasing numbers of failed states? I frankly doubt it. Yet whether we rationalize our requirement for nation-building as part of a war on terrorism or as part of our interest in maintaining a peaceful world, we have entered a period wherein we feel obliged to ask the American people to accept this reality. I think our government can offer them a better choice. Early in the Clinton administration, I created something of a stir by writing an opinion piece in the Washington Post suggesting that an emerging threat to U.S. interest was the general condition of chaos. I said that, quote, disintegrating societies and failed states have emerged as the greatest menace to global stability and should be seen as a strategic threat. A few weeks later, another piece appeared describing my suggestion as, quote, the foreign policy idea that was splitting Clinton's foreign policy team. The writer, Jeremy Rossner, became a friend of mine, said I had introduced a new doctrine that undervalues moral accountability. He asked, quote, what after the Cold War is the overarching threat to America's national security, chaos or malice? Well, first I was flattered. I had never been accused of creating a doctrine before, but I never did say that chaos was unrelated to malice. The conditions of anarchy, poverty, and chaos both produce malice and are exploited by those of malicious intent. The malice of individuals and governments, however, often relate to the conditions they confront. Why is it so difficult for foreign policy realists to accept that conditions of poverty and underdevelopment increase the likelihood of violent conflict? Perhaps this relates to the battle over resources that we have faced within the international affairs budget since the Vietnam War. Perhaps it relates to the hard versus soft side of the national security debate. It certainly does not relate to the evidence on hand. There are numerous studies and reports on the sources of violent conflict that show that the condition of poverty is the most significant contributing factor. Take the 1999 Commission on Global Governance report, which concluded as follows. Poverty provides scant basis either for the maintenance of traditional society or for any further development of participation in civic life and governance. Unfair in themselves, poverty and extreme disparities of income fuel both guilt and envy when made more visible by global telecommunications. Now, the last time I read Psychology 101, guilt and envy often produce malicious intent. I believe we owe it to the American taxpayer to do what we can to prevent costly nation-building exercises by preventing the breakdown of nation-states. Conditions do matter. When the gap between rich and poor widens, as it has, to more than 10 to 1, and when nearly half the world's population lives below the poverty line, anger and alienation are the byproducts. When 30,000 children die each day of diseases that are curable in the West, envy, guilt, and desperation are the byproducts. Not many of the poor are terrorists, and not all terrorists are poor, but we should be clear, poverty is the enemy of the United States. In the next 15 years, we will see another billion people join the world's population. 95% of those will be born in the developing world as our own Western populations age and shrink. How many of these people will be workers and consumers? How many will be wards of the international community? How many will choose the malice of terrorism? Conditions matter. The threat of chaos is a strategic threat. Prevention should be a priority, national security objective. The second priority should be to improve our capacity for nation building. Our capacity for preventing conflict is at a low point, but even if we start to emphasize prevention, we will always have a need for nation building. As Iraq has shown us, no department or agency of government embraces the nation-building mission. The Defense Department has the security mission, and it is not doing a very good job in Iraq. Our military is, but there are not adequate numbers of them even to protect themselves. DoD should not be involved in managing reconstruction projects. It has no competence to do so, and when it plays this role, it scares away other donors, other civilian agencies, and non-governmental organizations. The State Department can find outstanding crisis managers, but has little institutional capacity for managing programs. When people like Ambassador Bob Gelbart and Ambassador Jim Dobbins left the State Department after managing the transitions in Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Afghanistan, the department lost most of its institutional knowledge. USAID has the only units specifically created for transitional situations in their Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, the Food for Peace Office, and the Office of Transitions Initiatives. Yet USAID does not have a strong policy voice, and its resource base is too small. If we're going to get serious about prevention and post-conflict nation building, we need to think big. Our government not only lacks the capacity to address these two priority national security objectives, it is also terribly uncoordinated and incoherent in its approach to the developing world where the real challenge lies. We need a new government department whose missions would include preventive development, humanitarian relief, and nation building. This new department, which I hope I can coin a new phrase as successful as soft power, the Department for International Development Cooperation, would handle all bilateral and multilateral assistance programs, overseeing the World Bank and UN voluntary agencies, and coordinating the development work of all U.S. government departments, assuring that any U.S. government development initiative is part of an overall strategic approach in the object country or region. The department secretary also would carry the development perspective to the policy debates over trade and finance issues. We may never find the political will to end agricultural subsidies for American farmers, but at least the president should hear how damaging these subsidies are to our development and prevention objectives. This department would be the home of a new capacity to do nation building. It would have a permanent staff of expert troubleshooters who know how to manage transitions. Did you know that of the civilian positions made available to Ambassador Bremer in Iraq, they were successful this year in only filling about 58% of them? There is some hope that by the summer they'll get up to 70%. Who's going to volunteer? We need a group of people that are dedicated to this nation-building task. The department would pre-position supplies and work with other nations and the UN to assure that police, construction companies, reconciliation specialists, and elections experts are trained and ready for deployment. It would organize by region in the developing world and have access to the cultural and linguistic knowledge and skills appropriate to the region. It would work closely with DoD to devise security plans and with the State Department to incorporate diplomatic and political strategies. Now, is this all pie in the sky? The figment of a former aid administrator's wildest dreams? Perhaps. I know that most politicians in Washington don't want to be right before the time is right, but professionals with experience must tell our political leaders what we need, and I believe the need is overwhelming now, and it will be even more so in a decade's time. Before I conclude, let me anticipate what some of you may be thinking. Atwood has taken us from the sublime to the mundane, from the conceptual high of soft power to chaos theory and the need for prevention to organizational management theory. Perhaps next he will assign us to read Max Weber. In my defense, anyone who has listened to the 9/11 Commission hearings in the past few weeks must now grasp the importance of organizational culture in Washington. Government agencies are created to carry out a defined mission. If that mission is unrelated to a new challenge, bureaucracies will fail. And that's what happened to the FBI, and arguably to the CIA, to DoD, and to state. Organization matters and missions matter. In my humble opinion, a new president with the best of intentions and the best instincts about the new international challenges we face will have great difficulty preventing conflict and managing post-conflict transitions with the existing international affairs agencies. What I have proposed here today may sound to some of you like a radical idea. It is, in essence, the model used in the United Kingdom today. I would suggest that as a new government department, the Department for International Development Cooperation would be a lot more coherent than the Department for Homeland Security. It will have a close relationship to the State Department, but development policy and programs are no more foreign policy than they are trade and finance policy. Development itself encompasses the work of many domestic government agencies, though it is carried out in foreign lands with the purpose of helping others help themselves. If a new president wants to send a signal to a world that has grown skeptical of American policies, more than skeptical, hostile, what better way to do it than to create a Department for International Development Cooperation? The time for engagement, mutual respect, and cooperation is long past due. We cannot prevent a world of chaos and defeat terrorism by continuing to flaunt our power and by largely ignoring the international system that we helped create. We've tried it the neocon way, and we're paying a very heavy price. The United States has very special obligations in this world. We need to send a signal that we're prepared not only to lead, but to cooperate. The world needs our sense of optimism, our can-do attitude. It also needs a better coordinated U.S. government and more coherent U.S. policies, especially vis-a-vis the developing world. Perhaps through a reformed United Nations, we can even reshape the international system. To do this, we will need to get our own act together and begin to lead through the power of our example rather than exclusively through the example of our power. Thank you very much.
The floor is open for questions. you can come to a microphone, and please remember to state your name and affiliation.
I'm Bridget Moix with the Friends Committee on National Legislation and also Columbia University. I want to thank you very much for your comments and for the priority that you're placing on looking at prevention and on the role of development assistance and addressing poverty issues. I work in Washington and everything you say resonates strongly with what I think policymakers should be doing, the issues they should be addressing. But I know from walking the halls of Congress and talking to staff in Congress and members of Congress that these things are not top on the agenda, and that the perspective of policymakers in Washington on conflict is very outdated, in my opinion, and very different from what you've described. And I wonder if you could offer some advice on how we help move policymakers toward a paradigm of prevention, because I think right now we're stuck still in a paradigm of reaction. And I wonder if you could just address that.
I suppose a flip way of answering that question would be to present them each year with a bill for $87 billion. The Congress of the United States is way behind the American people on these issues, in my opinion. 2 nights ago, I traveled 2 hours outside of Minneapolis to a little town called Wilmer in Minnesota and spoke to about 100 people there. And I was fearful because everyone says rural Minnesota has become real right-wing. Everyone was nodding. Everyone was saying, that's right. You know, I really think the Congress should look again at the polling information that exists on these issues. The American people are way ahead of them. But it is true, as I said at the beginning, that politicians like to appear to be tough. And I'm not talking about men or women, I'm talking about both. I mean, they all want to appear to be tougher than the next person, and it's very hard to sort of make this distinction between the hard side and the soft side in a world with the kinds of threats that we face. And so I think it's really important to blend these things and to make that sound as pragmatic and hard-headed as possible. I'll say one other thing. Just about 3 weeks ago, I and Congressman Bill Frenzel, a Republican, launched a new political action committee, basically to support members of Congress or candidates for Congress who are enlightened on these issues. And, you know, there are a lot of NGOs and other good organizations that are able to generate a lot of letters in support of things, but there's been a missing link in terms of influencing Congress, and that is that we have to play according to the rules of the political system. I don't like those rules. I like to see those changed as well. But without a political action committee, you really don't have the same kind of influence that you would otherwise. And this political action committee not only will be supporting candidates, will be endorsing candidates, and will be presenting them with some of the polling information that exists that shows where the American people are on these issues.
Hi, I'm Daniel Collins from MIT and from Student Pugwash. Some time ago I read about USAIP, United States Institute for Peace, a federally funded group that wishes to achieve security solutions through non-military means such as development. You mentioned other groups, but you were framing them very much like what I see this group is performing. Is it not performing, perhaps because it doesn't have enough power, it's not funded, as the USAID is not, or is it blue wash, or something else?
It's performing very well. It's doing some excellent studies. I see Joe Montville over there who participates with the Institute for Peace on occasion. I don't know, you've done some studies for them, Joe. The problem is getting these studies to the political leaders and enabling them to have some impact. I do think it's an important institution. It's bipartisan. It should be beyond question in terms of whether or not there's a partisan tinge to it. Some really important studies, but they are more of an academic type of study, and it's much more difficult to make an impact. members of Congress, for the most part, I'm generalizing now, but they don't read long documents. They don't have time. I mean, they don't have time given all the other requirements. That after all, under our system, they have to be spending most of their time raising money. In any case, the Institute of Peace is really a superb change in Washington that's been in existence now, I guess, for about a decade, and it's made a real contribution, but it hasn't made a difference yet.
Thank you very much. Michael Small, I'm a visiting fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. A couple of years ago, I attended a small colloquium on peace-building issues that brought together a few people from international organizations, other private agencies, national governments. One visiting expert there, I'm happy to identify him, Barney Rubin, who's now at the Council on Foreign Relations, and at the time was one of the few experts in the United States on Afghanistan, and was reflecting, this is '99, that the most important decision taken by the American government on Afghanistan in the preceding decade, namely firing cruise missiles in '98 in response to the al-Qaeda bombings, was taken by not a single person who knew a single thing about Afghanistan. And from that, he extrapolated that there's an inverse relationship between the importance of any decision and the amount of knowledge that went into it. Anyhow, since the conference was entirely called Knowledge for What, and about examining that became christened the Rubin hypothesis, and we ran with it with a lot of fun for the next 2 days. Unfortunately, we've seen that played out on a much larger scale on more longer-lasting decisions since then. But I think it's not just unique to the U.S. government. I think it's a generic condition of political life and bureaucratic life. And given your distinguished career, both working in government and now in a policy school, I wondered if you have any reflections on how to better improve the transmission of ideas between those people who have the time to analyze things in depth and craft complex and profound statements, many of whom are students sitting right here in this room, and those people who've got 4 minutes at best to hear them, so that you don't get into that kind of situation of an inverse relationship between knowledge and decision-making capacity.
That's a hard question. I did serve at one point in my career as Assistant Secretary of State for Congressional Relations, and that was quite a challenge. I found that those who listened most intently were also those who never asked a question, and I often wondered whether I was actually getting through. It is difficult. It's the foreign policy process in Washington is a rather strange beast. When I was once Dean of Professional Studies at the Foreign Service Institute, and we did a case study. It was based on the sale of F-16s to Pakistan. And we actually asked some of our Foreign Service officers to play the role of members of Congress. We actually did this case in the House Foreign Affairs Committee room. It was during a recess. And and we had people also that played the role of the media, and some were witnesses for the executive branch and the like. Several of the people who played members of Congress came to me and said, I never realized the kinds of pressures that they have on them. I don't think one wants to, in this forum in particular, and in this school in particular, denigrate in any way the political life. It is extraordinarily difficult, perhaps made more difficult by the kinds of pressures we place through the system. But these are people, most of them are people of goodwill, who are trying not only to learn something about foreign affairs, but every other field that the U.S. government has to handle. In the House of Representatives, you have a better chance because they specialize, and their committees specialize, and they become experts over a period of time. All you have to do is watch someone like Lee Hamilton, now, after 30 years of being a member of Congress, co-chair of this commission on the 9/11 business, and Timothy Romer's another one. These are people that have really gained a great deal of expertise. They've taken it very seriously. I know Joe will remember this. When Lee Hamilton was chairing the Middle East Committee, he would have hearings every 2 weeks. One would be on Europe, which was the other half of his responsibilities, the other on the Middle East. And he would always do them in closed session. It would be classified information. In other words, it was being passed back and forth, and he would really cause the State Department to consider issues that it might not otherwise consider. So there have been some instances in our history, and that's just one, where the Congress really does cause us to stretch our brains downtown. So it isn't just a one-way street in terms of trying to influence them. They have often positively influenced us. I always like to think about the role that Hubert Humphrey played, given that I represent the school that has his name. He was a very, very positive force. Unfortunately, there aren't that many anymore that do this kind of thing. I think we need to encourage them to take these matters more seriously, perhaps encourage them to form caucuses that are interested in international affairs. I hope that this political action committee that we've formed will have some positive impact as well.
Steve, four questioners. First take the woman on the balcony, and then
Thank you. Good evening, Dean Edward. Thank you very much for sharing with us your idea about creating the new department. I'm just wondering why you recommended this instead of empowering, instead of the idea of empowering USAID and giving it more sort of a policy-making role. And the second question is, before we can create this department, are there any things that the U.S. can do to fill in, in terms of preventive measures and so on? Okay.
Well, I had assumed that in creating this new department, the development professionals of USAID would form the core of the new agency. Although clearly on the nation-building side, you need some specialized talents that would come in. So, and how it's so difficult. We all saw this with the Department for Homeland Security. It's difficult in Washington to create a new department. But frankly, a president who wants to do something of this nature would probably, in the honeymoon period of his new term, have some success in doing that, it seems to me. And even if he were not successful in getting a department, he could, for example, elevate the aid administrator to a cabinet position without having the approval of Congress. So there are a lot of things that could be done as an interim step, it seems to me. I know that Senators Lugar and Biden have made a proposal in this area. I think it's a step in the right direction, but I think it's kind of a stopgap step that basically has a coordinator created at the State Department. You still have to depend on other agencies that will come to the table, and getting cooperation when you do that, especially if it isn't done out of the White House, is extraordinarily difficult. But in any case, there are some interesting proposals being put forward. Usually they put proposals forward that don't cost any money, and so I think it's a question of really elevating the political consequences of not doing anything in this area. And as I said before, we're working on a time frame here where another 1 billion people are going to come onto the face of the earth. I mean, the international community, the system, is already stretched thin. It isn't working properly. And with another 1 billion people, and with the increasing poverty around the world, it's going to be a disaster unless we do something, and do it now, I think.
Yeah, I'm Kelly, an alumni of the Kennedy School. Approximately 20% of Americans have passports. By and large, most Americans speak only one language, and most Americans are unaware of how much anti-American sentiment exists out in the rest of the world. So to what extent do you believe that the lack of resources currently devoted to international development is due to a lack of involvement and knowledge by the American people in international affairs and development?
In some ways, the American people are inundated with news. That is, if they're not watching Fox News Channel. And as I indicated from my own experience in talking to sort of ordinary Americans, they absorb more than you would imagine. Now, they don't have the sensitivity to other cultures, perhaps, although we are the most diverse nation in the world, and generations of Americans have come from other places. So I don't underestimate the ability of the American people to react the right way if they're presented with the facts. I have no idea. We've got an election going on now. They're certainly going to hear two very different worldviews from the two candidates that are running. We'll have to see what choice they make in the end.
Good evening, Dean Atwood. Marina Lutova, student at the Kennedy School in International Development. On the Brahimi panel, you wrote the Brahimi report, which provided UN guidelines for peacekeeping operations. I was curious whether you could reflect on, given those guidelines, on the peacekeeping operations in Yugoslavia.
Well, of course, the United States took a very important role in Kosovo. It basically was a humanitarian intervention, I guess is the way people like Jonathan Moore, who's edited a book on this subject here at the Kennedy School, would call it. I think it was done for all the right purposes. We, several years later now, still have a force there, but we then turned to the United Nations and asked them if they would do the civilian side of the operation. We had just 3 or 4 weeks ago still more ethnic tensions in Kosovo, and we had to take some action. But I would point to the ratio of troops on the ground, NATO, American and NATO. The ratio there in Kosovo is a much better ratio than the situation that exists in Iraq. If we had the same ratio in Iraq, I can't recall the number, but it would be well over 500,000 troops on the ground. So there is a pervasive security presence. It's extraordinarily difficult where you've had a conflict situation, ethnic tension or whatever else, civil war, that you have a sufficient number of forces. And this was the Brahimi report recommending this to the UN. But I would certainly hope that the President of the United States would read this, and Rumsfeld as well. You have to have sufficient forces to deter the lingering forces of war. Those were the words we used in the Brahimi report. At the time we wrote the Brahimi report, there were UN blue-helmeted forces being held hostage in Sierra Leone because that advice wasn't taken. So we made it very, very clear in the Brahimi report that security was the most important first step. It seems to be something that was totally ignored the day after we won the so-called victory in Iraq.
I think we have 4 more people, and we'll probably take those questions and close up there.
Herb Howe, Georgetown University, sometimes known as the Harvard South, beginning with the Massachusetts-Connecticut line. I've got a question for you, Brian, and that it pertains to, in a sense, the soft power, hard power, which seems to be a fairly sharp demarcation that you made, at least until your last remarks here. Could you address a little bit about how the development community has increasingly become involved in security sector reform, and that development agencies have to work with militaries in countries like DFID has been doing, and that I think AID, the OTI, during your period got involved with Nigeria and a couple of other places, that development and the military are not necessarily demarcated, that people in the development community need to understand much more about military affairs to help prevent conflicts in other parts of the world.
Well, thank you, Herb. I'm glad you mentioned OTI. It's one of the legacies of the period I was there. I feel very proud of what we've accomplished there, and one of the directors of OTI, Joanna Mendelsohn, is here, and she and Rick Barton, who later became Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, really made that work. What we realized was that there was a gap in the development continuum, in that we would go in and provide humanitarian relief after a disaster, person-made or natural, and then we would bring in our long-term development thinkers, and they would study the problem for too long. And there was nothing being done as a stopgap to try to bring about reconciliation in the society, to look at how the society chose its new leaders through an electoral process, looking at community development, trying to get ethnic groups to work together, looking at the problems created by the impunities that occurred during the Civil War, and how one might create a tribunal to reconcile the society with respect to those problems. And so OTI did all of those things. It started, I think, with a budget of about $20 million, and I believe, while its regular budget is still only around 50 or 60, that it probably is spending closer to over $100 million today, and probably spending most of that in Iraq. But someone told me, Joanna, there was something like 3,000 OTI people in Iraq. Is that possible? No. Okay. In any case, it's an important element. But, you know, if you're going to be involved in post-conflict situations, you've got to work with security forces. And that's always difficult. One of the problems that you have, we experienced it a bit in Goma and Zaire after the Rwanda crisis. There's a gentleman here from Rwanda I was talking to earlier. And that is that the military is always looking for the exit strategy. They want to get out right away. And so it's really important, it seems to me, to assure that there is a security umbrella until the society really has reconciled itself, and that means a long period of time. We also, development professionals also understand that if you're going to be developing democracies, you also have to be working with security military people to make them understand that in a democracy, military leaders are supposed to be subject to the leadership of civilians. And it's a two-way street. The civilians, in many cases, I remember working in Argentina, the civilians didn't know anything about the way the military budget was put together. So you have to do some training of those people as well. So there's an awful lot of intersection between development professionals and military and security people.
My name is Dave Morris. I'm a student at Dartmouth College, and I work with a small nonprofit called the International Humanitarian Foundation. It focuses on connecting grassroots resources, or connecting grassroots community-based organizations with academic and financial resources. Given that your talk focused mostly on large-scale reconstruction efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, smaller kind of nonprofit or NGO sector organizations don't play as much of a role, but I wanted to ask, in the preventative aspect of development that you discussed, and also within some of these reconstruction efforts, what role and relevance do nonprofit organizations or development NGOs, civil sector organizations have?
There is no way I could exaggerate the importance of people-to-people programs, and AID in particular, even though it's government money, and there are some humanitarian organizations that don't want to take government money, but for the most part, there's a huge network of humanitarian organizations that do a variety of things: farmer-to-farmer programs, community development, rural development programs, democracy-building programs, where people from one country, and it may be a multitude of countries, are going in and working with the people of the country involved. I personally believe to be successful in a place like Iraq, which I'm not terribly optimistic about it today, but I'm generally optimistic. You need to bring in a lot of Arabic-speaking people. You need to bring in people from other countries, Jordan and Morocco and the like, so that you can make those connections and so that people don't feel threatened. One of the problems, and I alluded to it but didn't state it explicitly, is that most government agencies in Washington have a domestic mission, meaning they're serving the American people in one way or the other. There's nothing wrong with that, except that their mission isn't development of another country's society. It is working perhaps in another country, if you're the Justice Department, so that you can help enhance your own access to criminals who might be affecting the United States. If you're a drug agency, you're really more interested in making arrests or creating a network so that you can work within that criminal context. There is only really one agency in the U.S. government that has the interest of helping other people help themselves, and that is USAID, with its vast number of non-governmental organizations and even for-profit organizations that work with it.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Chris Neal, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School of Government. My question is, you mentioned earlier that the U.S. should target poverty as part of its national security strategy and priorities. And I'm wondering if that poses certain risks. So, for example, if this new department that you mentioned were put into place, there would be new resources available to put into development. But I'm wondering if that might run the risk of putting resources into only those states that are poor and close to failing, while also neglecting a number of states that are poor but maybe not as close to failure. So I'm wondering, first, do you think that that is a risk of focusing on prevention as a national security priority? And is selectivity a positive thing, or is there a way to reframe the argument to be more inclusive of states that are poor but not necessarily close to becoming failed states?
I think if you use a development cooperation paradigm, the selectivity is really a self-selecting situation. I wouldn't waste development money. I might spend other kinds of money, but on states that, for example, abuse human rights or who don't allow their own people to have a voice within their own system. I think that's a waste of development resources. But because of the democratic revolution around the world, there are more states with whom one could work. I also want to say this, take the opportunity to say this, that there's a tremendous amount of consensus in the world between developing countries and the donor nations nowadays as to what the goals are. There are a whole series of UN agreements. There is the 21st Century Report of the Development Assistance Committee, the goals of eliminating or reducing extreme poverty by 1/2 by the year 2015, of further reducing infant mortality. There are a whole series of goals. So unlike any other area of international cooperation, there is a consensus as to how to approach this and what needs to be done. There are also some really interesting new frameworks. You have in your audience a person by the name of Michael Fairbanks, who has written extensively on the issue of how one creates wealth in another society, the 7 sources of wealth. I refer you to this and to look at his chapter in the book by Sam Huntington, edited by Sam Huntington, called Culture Matters. Hernando de Soto, who's written, the last book was The Mystery of Capitalism. There are all sorts of new ideas, innovations, technological and just intellectual, that I think can make a real contribution. We have never, in the 55 or so years we've been doing development assistance, had as much consensus and had as many tools available to us to actually make a difference in the world. And for people to suggest that foreign aid just doesn't work, they're looking back at the Cold War when we wasted aid because we didn't have development as the objective. You can waste a lot of aid if politics is your objective. And I think today, and I must give the Bush administration credit for this, there was a very serious debate over this new Millennium Challenge account as to how one would create eligibility criteria and how one would spend that money. The court is still out as to whether they'll spend it well, but the fact of the matter is that at least there's more of a consensus that there should be a development goal in Washington than there ever has been before. And now the real question is to make sure that the resources are available so that when countries do self-select, the money is available to do the work.
Glad you spoke about the Millennium Challenge account. I used my prerogatives and moderator to
Ask about it.
One final question.
Okay, I'm Joe Monfil of Center for Strategic International Studies, American University and George Mason University, retired State Department Foreign Service. Wonderful to see you and even more wonderful to hear you. I fully support your proposal, and it's a very street-smart solution to trying to mobilize the resources and the power in the foreign affairs debate. It's a very, very sensible. And I hope President Kerry asks you to at least help in the implementation of it. The reason I got up, I don't usually, is that you mentioned Max Weber. And I am on a panel tomorrow on religion and conflict resolution. And I've been doing a lot of work in the Abrahamic faiths. One of the great dilemmas always in advancing in the American political culture, the idea of preventive interventions, helping the poor, has been that if you're just trying to be good, it really is hard to sell in our political culture. If I think it's going to sell if it's seen as a critical counterterrorism activity. I first started studying Arabic at the Middle East Center here in 1959 as a National Defense Foreign Language Fellow. And I learned fairly soon that if you put national defense in front of it, you can always get it passed. But however you sell it, there's a real philosophical dilemma in our political culture, and I thought it'd be worth just pointing out here, because Max Weber tried to understand in his the Protestant ethic and the theory of capitalism, and that is the way capitalism evolved. Caring was seen as not really serious, caring about the weak and the poor. In other words, the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount didn't make it into the theory about capitalism, and it's also very much rooted in the Hebrew Bible and the Quran. It's just a point, I think it'd be worth graduate students of government to really contemplate how issues of just caring can find their way integrated into government philosophies. As I say, you'll have to put the face of counterterrorism on it for a while. But we might find at some point, a few decades down the way, that it's actually not a bad set of standards in terms of defining policies and governance, and that's all.
That's a very good statement, Joe, and it's so much there that I will take a piece of it and try to respond to it. You know, capitalism has a very shady side, and we've seen it a lot. We saw it in the early days of the United States before antitrust came into place, and we see it now in Russia. We see that half-formed capitalist systems can really be worse than what preceded them, and there are many people in the former communist world now that are thinking, well, it was a much more gentle existence in the old days. But you have to move your way through those things. And what I find in the developing world is the most significant problem in putting in a capitalist system that is benign and which actually does the job of creating wealth is the lack of microeconomic systems. They don't have banking systems or tax systems that work and the like. And if you create a capitalist system and you don't have a regulatory framework and or microeconomic systems that work, you're basically creating a jungle. And it's every person for themselves, and a lot of abuse can take place. And that gives development a bad name, it gives capitalism a bad name, and the like. I mean, every democracy, of course, holds the opportunity for people to come forward with different economic views. We certainly are going to have an interesting debate over whether it makes sense to give people as big a tax cut, for example, in this society as we have, or to spend it on other things. But in developing countries, that's a debate that is a luxury. And usually the big money is made through abuse and corruption. And there is no bigger cancer for developing countries than corruption. And I think a few years back when I had to go to the OECD to speak, I gave a lecture. I think it was taken that way as well by my fellow development ministers on corruption, because several of the countries who went in and said, you know, you need to develop your economy and you need to get rid of this corruption, were actually giving tax breaks to their businessmen and women for going in and paying bribes in these same countries. And now we've moved beyond that, and the OECD has adopted procedures that are very similar to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States. And I'm not sure we've moved entirely beyond that, but I think there is a growing consensus that we need to get at this corruption problem. That's not dealing with half of what you said, but I'm glad you said it.
I want to thank Dean Atwood on behalf of all of us for a very thoughtful and provocative talk that I think will set a good tone for the next 2 days' discussions. But before you part, Alessandra Zuber wants to tell you about the next 2 days.
Well, I was happy to hear that Dean Atwood covered a lot of the panel titles that we will be addressing, a lot of the concerns, exit strategies, and private contractors in reconstruction, and there are a lot of questions about how to implement this model that Dean Atwood had presented. Well, we have a workshop on lobbying Congress and on development issues. So I was happy to hear that we will be addressing some of the concerns that came up tonight. Tomorrow we will begin at 7:30 a.m. For those early risers with breakfast and registration in the Taubman building. Next to us. That will run until 9:30 a.m. when our first panel begins. In between there, we will have another keynote speaker at 8:30 a.m. here in the forum. And it's Dr. Silas Wakamamba, who comes to us from Rwanda, and he'll speak to us about the reconstruction of Rwanda and about development in Africa in general. Then we will proceed throughout the day with 4 different sessions of about 18 or 19 different panels. We will also have a few extra activities this year. We have panelist lunches where you can gather in groups of about 8 participants and have a lunch with your favorite panelist. But you have to sign up for those early because they're going to fill up on a first come, first serve basis. We also have workshops on Sunday, which are free. Please look at the advertisements at registration to sign up for those. And we have breakout sessions this year, where if you're really into a panel and would like to follow up discussion in a smaller group with your panelists, you'll be able to do that after your panel. I think that's it. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.